Hi, everyone. Today's notes are going to be the timeline for World War One, and then hopefully we'll see how quickly I can get through it. Hopefully, also the changes, the advancements in technology that come along with World War One as well. So the way I have these organized is as chronological as they can be in a world where some of the events cross over each other. But it might be helpful if you took a piece of paper and made your own little timeline so you could keep track of things. That might be helpful for some of you guys who are super visual. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. Answer the questions as they pop up, and I'll go ahead and get started. So in your causes notes, you already talked about the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Remember that he's from Austria, and there's a big Serbian independence movement that is happening through the early 1900s, and the assassination of the Austrian Archduke, who had control over that area, is what leads with those system of alliances to the beginnings of the war. So we're going to go ahead and skip that, but know that that's where that happened. So you have to know a couple of battles for World War One, and the first one is the Battle of Tannenberg. So Tannenberg is in Western Russia, and the Germans were trying to go, across. Let's draw our little compass rose for just a second so you can think about this. West, east, south, north, right? So it's in this western section of Russia, as the Germans are trying to advance into Russia. And it's a fairly decisive victory. You'll get to some notes later talking about the terrible things that are happening in Russia. And this is sort of just an example of the Germans are way more prepared to fight a modern war than the Russians were. And they just take over and decimate the Russian population. A fun fact is that it's actually... it takes place, I want to say, about 30 miles away from the city of Tannenberg. But the Germans, when they named the battle, refer to it as the Battle of Tannenberg because there was a battle 500 years earlier that the Germans lost there, that German people lost there. And so they were trying to reclaim that name for themselves. So that's kind of cool. September of 1914... About the entire month is the First Battle of the Marne. There are two battles of the Marne. They both happen in the same region. The Marne is a river in France. But it's a French and British victory over the Germans in France. So if you think back to your causes, if this is Germany is fighting a two-front war. They're fighting the French in the western section, and they're fighting the Russians in the eastern section. So Tannenberg is a Western Russian Eastern Front War, and the Battle of the Marne is a Western Front War where the Germans are fighting on the west. It is the end of the British attempts to invade France through Belgium. So basically the deal was with the Schlieffen Plan, I'm not sure how to say that. Germany was trying to take over France very, very quickly, and the French had fortified their entire border with Germany, and so the Germans were trying to go around Belgium and down into France, through Belgium down into France, around the French defenses, and the French just adjusted their people, and that Battle of the Marne is where the French dug in, and the Belgians are participating in this, and the British are participating in this, and they stop the German advance. So the Germans realize that they won't be able to take over all of France at that point. From the all of 1915 to early 1916 is something called the Gallipoli Campaign. Gallipoli Campaign is over Constantinople, that city that bridges the gap between Europe and the Middle East and Asia. And it's under Ottoman control, and the Ottomans are a central power. And under Winston Churchill, who later becomes the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He's fairly young early in his career, and he comes up with this amphibious assault where the British lead the Allied forces in an attack of the Ottoman Empire, thinking that they could defeat the Ottoman Empire very quickly, gain control of Constantinople, and have a massive entrance port into southern Europe. It's a devastating loss to the British, to the Allies. The Ottomans win. They maintain control of that region. A lot of historical scholars will say that if the Gallipoli Campaign had been successful, the war probably would have been shorter because they would have lost that supply line. The Central Powers would have lost that supply line into Europe. It also almost ends the career of Winston Churchill because it's very embarrassing for him. He resigns from his position, and it takes a long time for his career arc to come back. There was some talk that that was going to be the end of him, but he does come back because he's a major player in World War II. So at the same time, or shortly thereafter, is the Battle of the Somme, which is in France as well, again against Germany. And it's most notable, not for being necessarily the most deadly of all World War I battles, we'll get to that in a minute, but it's certainly one of the most heavily manned battles in history. So there are over 3 million people that are participating in this battle over the course of, a couple of months, right? In the summer and fall of 1916. 3 million people are fighting in the same place. It's massive. It is a victory for the Allies ultimately, though it's not. It's kind of one of those sort of stalemate battles where no one really gained a whole lot of ground anyway. All right. At the same time as the Battle of the Somme is also the Battle of Verdun. So, think about that. I just told you there were 3 million people at the Battle of the Somme. During the exact same time period, you're having the Battle of Verdun, which is one of the most costly battles ever, with more than 70,000 casualties per month, and it runs for 8 months. No, it's longer than that. 11 months. So 11 months at 70,000 people per month is deadly. So that's the thing about World War I is that's why it's they call it the Great War. It's why it's such a massive thing, is there are so many people from all over the world that are involved in this human crisis. If you fast forward a little bit, you go to April 1917 in the United States. We have to end our isolationist policies and join the war. There's a couple of things at play here. Number one, most politicians agreed that at some point we were going to have to step in because we weren't going to let the French and the British lose, right? They're our major allies. But it was sort of a matter of when and why. And one of the things that people who were pro entering World War I had to get a handle on is they needed a reason why. They needed an actual United States impact, just as opposed to the people we perceive as the good guys are losing. And so there's 2 things that happen that help turn the tide. And I have it written sort of backwards. I want to talk first about the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania is a passenger ship that was carrying people like the Titanic, right? It's a steamship that's going across the Atlantic carrying passengers that is sank by a German U-boat, a German submarine. And there's 100 and some Americans that are on board who die in that sinking. And so that's an attack on American lives, a perceived violent and unnecessary attack on American citizens. And realistically, the Germans sink it because they believed, and rightfully so, that the United States was shipping supplies secretly in cargo holds of passenger ships because the Germans weren't attacking passenger ships. And so the Germans stopped that policy of only attacking military ships when they found that out. But we didn't obviously talk about that. We were like, oh my gosh, this perfect, innocent people, these lives have been destroyed at the hands of the terrible Germans, when really it was because we were sending supplies to the British that way. And the other one is the Zimmermann telegram. So the Zimmermann telegram was a message sent from Germany to Mexico. And it was asking Mexico to involve themselves in the war, not by sending troops to Germany, but by attacking the United States. And the thought process was that if the Germans would attack the United States, then the United States would be busy fighting the Mexicans in Texas and Arizona and New Mexico, instead of being able to support the British and the French in Europe. It doesn't happen because, number one, we intercede the message and it helps turn the tide and join us in the war. But also because Mexico was not interested. Mexico had their own problems and they didn't need to be involved in another war. The goal, I think, or the appeal for the Germans were trying to make towards Mexico was that they would regain the territories that they had lost from the United States. But it's not something that ever happens. Mexico doesn't attack Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, so it's not a problem. And then Russia then immediately thereafter, within a year or so, has to completely resign from the war themselves. They sign a treaty and they exit from World War I, which ends the battle on the Eastern Front. So Germany can focus all of their attention in the West. Not that they have that much time. It's only a couple more months and then the war is over. But Russia signed something called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where they basically give up a lot of their Western territory that the Germans had taken over. But the problem is that they were dealing with their own civil war, right? They have these revolutions happening in 1917 in Russia. They're trying to depose their king, get rid of the Tsar, and create a new democratic government, which then leads to another civil war where they have a communist revolution. And so they were having their own problems and did not have time to fight in a war against Germany. And then the war ends in 1918. They are going to ultimately sign something called the Treaty of Versailles to end the war. But the treaty doesn't get signed, obviously, for a while. But the war stops in the 11th hour, so 11 o'clock, on the 11th day of the 11th month. So November 11th at 11 o'clock in the morning, everywhere was a ceasefire, and that's when the war ended. So they knew for a couple of weeks what time it was officially over. But that's so that they had enough time to notify everyone and that sort of thing. And that's also why we celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th, is in honor of the armistice of World War I. So that's all the events of World War I. But just to talk about how the war is different from wars in the past, there are some major advances and changes that are happening to how wars are fought with World War I. And propaganda, which I'm not even sure I spelled right, I'm not sure that's spelled correctly. But propaganda is government messaging, and that's been happening anyway. But there are these major campaigns globally to put out these public flyers and public information and radio ads and that sort of thing, trying to convince people that your side is right, the other side is bad. And that's happening globally. But these others are all technological changes that have changed the way wars are fought. And they all sort of go together. We have the first use of machine guns and tanks. And because of these things, you start digging trenches to live in the trenches. And trench lifestyle is really terrible. It's hard. It's frustrating. It's dirty. It's dangerous. We also implement chemical warfare with poison gas. And this, you can see he's wearing a gas mask here. But the part of the problem with the gas is that it was heavier than the air, and so it would sink down into the trenches. We've already talked about submarines, that we're having the first uses of submarines. You also have early airplanes. I don't know why that's not on here, but you have early airplanes with like the Red Baron. So there's all these new modern industrial revolution changes that have happened in these technologies that we're now able to use that are going to make World War I much more deadly, much more long-lasting, much more horrifying than any of the wars have in the past. So that's one of the big shifts that happens with World War I. All right, well, that's all I have for you today. Let me know if you guys have any questions.